Welcome to this episode of the BA Sports Podcast. Today, we're going to be going through the week 3 start sits, sleepers, and busts. So let's start off with the quarterback position, then go into the running back position, wide receivers, tight ends. Then I'll touch on defenses and kickers at the very end. So yeah, let's get started with the quarterback starts. I really love Joe Burrow this week. Joe Burrow, Cincinnati playing the worst passing defense, in my opinion, and actually, based on the stats, the Washington Commanders, they get them on Monday Night Football. There's much more need to be said about starting Joe Burrow. I mean, sure, he had a bad week 1. He bounced back in week 2. Didn't have the greatest of week 1s, but, shaking that rust off after missing a lot of games last year. He could have T. Higgins back in this one. Hopefully, T. Higgins did practice today. But if not, I still expect him to use his other weapons. Jamar Chase should have a big game. Gesicki has looked good. And let's not forget about Zach Moss and Chase Brown. This should be a set it and forget it as your starting quarterback for Joe Burrow. That is one of my starts. Another quarterback start I really like is Derek Carr. Do we really need to talk much more about Derek Carr? I mean, number 2 in fantasy points this season. He is averaging 26.6 fantasy points per game. I believe that is 6 passing point per passing touchdowns. He hasn't been pressured that much. He's only been pressured on 8 out of 43 dropbacks. However, when he has been pressured, he has the highest PFF rating, passer grade that is. He's 6 of 8 for 147 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Eagles also present a great matchup for the Saints wide receivers. They're 10th worst in PFF coverage grade. As we saw on the final drive of the Falcons-Eagles game, I mean, they got dismantled. The Falcons took over. The Falcons won that game. I expect the Saints wide receivers to have a great day against this Eagles secondary, who has not been great, wasn't great last year, doesn't look great right now. The Saints have league best average separation generated for their quarterbacks. Thank you, Kubiak. I also expect the Saints offense to continue to be one of the best in the league with Clint Kubiak as the offensive coordinator. Fire up Derek Carr in week 3. Now, let's move on to some sits at the quarterback position. This one, it's not going to really surprise many people. It's Matthew Stafford of the Los Angeles Chargers. All of his weapons are hurt, his starting weapons at least. He still has some backup ones in Demarcus Robinson and Tyler Johnson. He's still got Kyron Williams healthy, but the 2 best wide receivers on this team are hurt in Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. This doesn't bode well for Stafford. Also, another thing that doesn't bode well for Stafford is his whole offensive line is banged up, so it's not giving him great protection. He gets this San Francisco defense, who is one of the better defenses in this league, and I think they're going to show it in this one and put pressure on Stafford with the decimated O-line, wide receivers not being healthy, and Puka and Kupp. He's only averaging 11.7 fantasy points through 2 weeks. That's not great. He didn't do well last week. I believe he only got like six or 6.5 points for as a quarterback. That's not great for your starting quarterback. Please sit Matthew Stafford this week. There are better options out there. I think I'd rather have Geno Smith over Matthew Stafford right now. Geno Smith doing really well, and that actually moves me into my sleepers. He is one of my sleepers at the quarterback position. I believe he is a good low-end QB1 start. This Dolphins secondary has not looked great. The Dolphins defense in general has not looked great. And I think Geno Smith can take advantage of this, which is why I have him as one of my sleepers. Another sleeper I have, the bad Panthers defense goes into Las Vegas and fire up Gardner Minshew as a sleeper this week. He's looked pretty good against a tough Baltimore secondary, and then the Chargers, who have played way better defense this year. I think that has something to do with the coaching change. I mean, Gardner Minshew has weapons. They are passing at one of the highest rates in the NFL, if not the highest rate, actually. And I think Gardner Minshew can comfortably fill in as a QB2 in Superflex leagues if you need him. Now, if you're trying to start him as your QB1 in a 1 QB league, I think there may be better options out there unless you're in a super deep league. But if that's all there's left, then I don't mind it. But if you can find someone else better than him and you're not in like a crazy deep league like Geno Smith, maybe Brock Purdy, I even like Caleb Williams this week. And those are a couple of sleepers. Now we're going to move into the busts at each position, starting off with the quarterbacks. Busts at the quarterback position. One guy I'm not feeling this week, but I know you're going to start him regardless because he is one of the greatest of all time, is Patrick Mahomes. Since week 8 of last year, Mahomes has only averaged 14.4 fantasy points per game in 4-point per passing touchdown leagues. He's over that 11 game span, he's broken 20 fantasy points per game twice. He gets a tough Atlanta secondary. They beefed it up this summer, adding Justin Simmons. They have AJ Terrell, and let's not forget about Jesse Bates. So those are 3 stud DBs they have, and Mahomes hasn't looked great. They've been running the ball more. Now, maybe with this Pacheco injury, you can see the passing volume going up and him and Kelsey connecting more, him and Rashee Rice continuing this connection. Noah Hollywood Brown, he's on IR, but maybe Xavier Worthy steps up. The rookie looked good in week 1, scored 2 touchdowns on like 3 touches. I would think they'd need him in this one. Carson Steele is going to be the running back. Samaje Perine is going to be backing him up. Let's not forget about Kareem Hunt being signed to the practice squad. I'm not expecting these backs to make a huge impact, as big of an impact as Pacheco is that has made throughout the past year and a half. But the Chiefs could go pass heavy, but I mean, I know you're going to start Mahomes regardless, but don't be surprised if he busts because he hasn't scored over 20 fantasy points per game that often since week 11 of last year. But it's hard to sit Mahomes. I understand that, which is why he's not my sit. He's one of my busts. Let's move on to the running back position. The running back position is very interesting. It's very thin. We've had a lot of injuries. It's not fun dealing with all these injuries. Christian McCaffrey on IR. We've had Kenneth Walker miss last week and possibly this week. Joe Mixon is banged up, looking to miss this week. So if you have some of these handcuffs, like Jordan Mason for Christian McCaffrey has proved to be a reliable handcuff. Last week, Zach Charbonnet, not very efficient, but he got the job done. He got in the end zone, and he scored a good amount of fantasy points for you. And, hey, I'm right back to him. He's one of my starts in week 3. If Ken Walker does play, I'm starting Ken Walker, and I downgrade Charbonnet to more of a sleeper flex play with some upside. But if Ken Walker can't go, Zach Charbonnet is going to see all the work. He saw the work last week. He didn't do well, but he got the job done. He wasn't efficient, but he got the job done. The Dolphins defense has allowed 4.96 yards per carry to running backs through 2 weeks. This defense is not as good as they have been in the past couple years. We saw James Cook run wild last week. Ray Davis even looked good. Tank Bigsby looked very good week 1 against this Dolphins defense. Travis Etienne looked good, but Tank Bigsby was the back who gained more yards. Whether it's Charbonnet or Ken Walker, I expect them to have a great game against the Dolphins. Ken Walker is the better back, but if he's out, you can fill in Zach Charbonnet if you have the handcuff, or if he's one of your running backs on the bench and you don't even have Ken Walker. Ken Walker doesn't go. Fire up Zach Charbonnet. I like him as a start this week. Another running back I like as a start is Tony Pollard. The Packers have allowed the 4th most yards per carry through 2 weeks at 5.49 yards per carry. Pollard has been the lead back here in Tennessee. What would upgrade him even more is Tajay Spears is hurt, another running back injury. If Tajay Spears somehow doesn't go, although right now he's leaning towards playing, that just upgrades Pollard even more on my start list and will move him up the rankings. I'm confidently starting him as an RB2 this week with Spears getting hurt and Callahan. I know Callahan does not trust Will Levis with the ball in his hands after his disastrous, 2 weeks in a row. That play he had against the Jets where he tried to toss it back to Tyjae Spears and fumble the ball, Jets recover, changes the momentum, takes away points. Really, I think cost the Titans the game in that one. But yeah, I think that Callahan is going to try and get the ball into Tony Pollard's hand and keep Will Levis from having too big of an impact on them getting the W. But that's why I like Tony Pollard as a running back start in week 3. And some running back sits. I do not like Aaron Jones this week. The Texans defense has proved one of the better run defenses in this league. Running backs have averaged a league low 2.27 yards per carry versus Houston. That was not great for Aaron Jones. 33 carries for 75 yards is what they've allowed. Now, they did allow Khalil Herbert and Jonathan Taylor to score in week 1 and week 2. But I think this defense will make it tough for Aaron Jones. Also, Ty Chandler has looked the better back in Minnesota, one could argue. He had 10 carries for 82 yards last week. I think if Minnesota sees Aaron Jones struggling, maybe they try and ride the hot hand of Ty Chandler and get Ty Chandler a little more work. I think they're going to struggle, though, running the ball against this Houston front. This defense has been underrated to start the year, and I believe they can go into Minnesota and beat the Vikings with this vaunted defense, not to mention their great offense. Another running back sit is Najee Harris. He has not reached double-digit fantasy points in weeks 1 or 2. Not great. He faces a tough Chargers defense who has looked way better against the run this year. And, they did struggle to stop Alexander Mattison week 1. He had 4 catches, 43 yards, and a touchdown. And then last week, Chuba Hubbard had 4 catches for 12 yards on 5 targets. I don't think Harris is more the receiving back in this offense, as we've seen in the past. It's Jaylen Warren. So I could see the Steelers leaning on Jaylen Warren as a pass-catching back against this Chargers defense a little more than they have. It's week 3 now. Jaylen Warren's getting a little healthier. I know he was banged up in the preseason, and I don't think he was 100% week 1. He looked better in week 2. He actually outsnapped Najee in week 2, which is shocking. He outsnapped him 32 to 30 snaps. So he outsnapped him by 2 snaps. So I could see Jaylen Warren getting his work ramped up in week 3 against this Chargers defense, who isn't great against receiving backs. I mean, it's a 2-week sample size, so it's hard to tell. But from what we've seen so far, Alexander Madison's made an impact. And Chuba Hubbard, 4 catches for 12 yards, not much of an impact, but they're allowing PPR points to rack up, and I think Jaylen Warren is the better option, but I'm not a huge fan of this backfield right now. I'd say Jaylen Warren is a boomer bust flex play this week. He'll be one of my sleepers this week in that game. Now, for sleepers at the running back position, running back DeAndre Swift has not done well this year. He has not done well. The Bears offense in general has not done well. They have not looked good at all, but this Colts defense is bad versus the run. Look at what Josh Jacobs did in week 2. Look at what Joe Mixon did in week 1. DeForest Buckner is on the IR. They sent him to the IR this week. DeForest Buckner has been a big, impactful player for this defense in the run game, in stopping the run. So I think without him, they're going to be even worse. It's tough to trust the Colts run defense. So fire up DeAndre Swift. I like him as a flex play. I also like him as a low-end RB2 play. I think you can feel comfortable starting DeAndre Swift, even though he hasn't looked good in the first 2 weeks. I think this is the spot to turn it around. He's faced a tough defense. The Texans last week, they allow a league low in yards per carry rushing the ball. And then the Titans have looked good. They're a very underrated defense in week 1 who the Bears faced. So this is a better matchup for DeAndre Swift. I like DeAndre Swift as a sleeper this week. Another sleeper is Bucky Irving, running back of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Broncos have not been great versus the run. If Rachaad White is out, I think this just helps Bucky Irving's case even more. While I don't think he would be the workhorse back, I expect him to get a majority of the snaps. if Rachaad White is indeed out. Now, if he's not out, I still expect Bucky Irving to make some sort of an impact. So in deeper leagues, he could be a boom bust flex play, but he has looked the more efficient back for Tampa, and I like taking the younger running back. So worst case scenario is just stash him if you can, because if he somehow breaks out this week and he's out there and you're going to have to wait for waivers now, if you have the ability to stash Bucky Irving, make sure you're stashing him. I know he's not available in many leagues. I think he's taken in all of my leagues, except one I have him in. I've actually was able to stash him, so that's good. But now let's move into the busts at the running back position. James Conner is my bust at the running back position. You know, they face this Detroit defense who have stifled running backs all year. As we saw last week and in week 1, they've only allowed one touchdown all year, and that is Kyren Williams in week 1. They're not allowing the running backs to catch the ball either. 4 catches for 9 yards. They're only allowing 2.86 yards per carry, 37 carries for 106 yards. DJ Reader was back last week. I expect him to get more snaps this week. So that helps this Detroit Lions defense even more. I'm sure they're glad to have him back. I don't think James Conner does well in this matchup. I think the Cardinals end up passing the ball. So fire up Kyler Murray, fire up Trey McBride, fire up Marvin Harrison Jr., even Michael Wilson as a sleeper, Greg Dortch as a sleeper. I like the Cardinals passing offense, their rushing offense. I think they're going to struggle to run the ball. And that is the running back position, the starts, sits, sleepers, and busts. If you want to know my full start, sits, sleepers, and busts for every game, make sure you're following me on Twitter or the X. I'm going to be posting the weekly matchup analysis every Saturday for all the NFL games, and then every Wednesday for the Thursday night games. So make sure you follow me at BA Sports Podcast on Twitter or the X to get the weekly matchup analysis so you can see all my starts, sits, sleepers, and busts. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them to me on Twitter or the X. I will respond as fast as I can and as best as I can. Let's move on to the wide receiver position. Let's start off with the starts at the wide receiver position. This one's pretty simple. These two should be no-brainers. I know they have underperformed in the first 2 weeks. My first start is Brandon Ayuk, wide receiver of the San Francisco 49ers. Deebo Samuel is looking like he'll be out a couple games. George Kittle just injured his hamstring in practice. So that's not looking good for him this week. So they're going to be really low on weapons in week 3. Juwan Jennings and Brandon Ayuk are headlining those weapons along with Jordan Mason. Brock Purdy is doing what he can with little weapons he has. Christian McCaffrey's on IR, so don't expect him. But Brandon Ayuk, with all those players being out, I expect an increased workload for him and Juwan Jennings. And hopefully Ayuk has shaken this rust off that we've seen in weeks 1 and 2. The Rams are rated as the 8th best matchup for wide receivers per PFF, with little to no competition at the wide receiver position for targets. I expect Ayuk to have a big game against this not so great Los Angeles secondary. My next wide receiver ties into my start at the quarterback position, Ja'Marr Chase. Now, he is expected to get T. Higgins back this week alongside him, which I think helps him, helps draw coverage away. But, I mean, this one should not be hard. You drafted him in the first round, maybe the second round if it was a super flex league. Not much more needs to be said about Ja'Marr Chase. He's one of the better wide receivers in the NFL. Now, he hasn't looked great, but he hasn't had great matchups. New England, he got paired up with Christian Gonzalez. As we've seen, Christian Gonzalez tonight has done a decent job against Garrett Wilson, although he did allow Garrett Wilson to score a touchdown. And I still think Christian Gonzalez had insane coverage on that touchdown throw that Rodgers just put in the perfect spot for Garrett Wilson. But Christian Gonzalez, he's looked good. And not to mention the Kansas City secondary in Kansas City. That's a tough matchup for anyone. And so not surprised Ja'Marr Chase struggled last week. But he gets the Commanders defense this week, and the Commanders can't cover anyone. As we saw, Malik Neighbors last week went off. I mean, went off. And that was so fun to watch. And I think Ja'Marr Chase has the ability to put up 40, 50 points in fantasy this week. I think he could easily put up a 40-point game and win you your week. There's no way you're benching Ja'Marr Chase. So fire him up as a start this week. Let's move on to some more starts I do like at the wide receiver position. Marvin Harrison Jr., I think you got to fire him up. Like I said, with Ja'Marr Chase, you drafted him early. You're not going to sit the guy unless somehow you've come upon a better option. I don't know how you would have, but you're starting Marvin Harrison Jr. If you sat him last week, I'm sorry, but I had him as a start. You should start Marvin Harrison. And then DJ Moore, a guy who hasn't been great to start off, but he's drawn a ton of targets, 18 targets, tied 7th in the NFL. And Indianapolis, their run defense isn't good. Their pass defense is not much better. They've allowed the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers. If Keenan Allen is still out, Rome Odunze is banged up, DJ Moore is the prime target for Caleb Williams, which is why he's tied 7th for the most targets in the NFL. I think Caleb Williams will be looking his way as these two look to get on track and propel this Bears offense over Indianapolis in week 3. Those are a couple more starts I have. Let's move on to some sits at the wide receiver position. I'm going to sit Jalen Waddle. No Tua, and he only averages about 10 PPR fantasy points per game without Tua. Skylar Thompson, not the best quarterback. I'm sitting him this week if I can. If you can't, I'm not mad about playing him in my flex or a wide receiver 3 in a 3 wide receiver league, but avoid it if you can. If you have better bench depth than most and you're in a shallow league, fire up sit Jalen Waddle and fire up someone else. Another guy I think you should sit is Tyler Lockett. It's the JSN and DK Metcalf show in Seattle. They're heading back to Seattle to face the Dolphins. And I think Tyler Lockett at best is a boom bust flex play. I'm not trying to play Tyler Lockett this week. I'd rather start Jackson Smith-Njigba. I'd rather start Jalen Waddle, honestly. But those are 2 sits. Another sit I have is Courtland Sutton. Does much more need to be said other than Bo Nix is just bad? This offense doesn't look great right now. They have to go into Tampa. The slot wide receiver has played a prime role in this offense, as we saw with Vele in week 1, and I believe Lil Jordan Humphrey in week 2. Let me look that up really quick because I believe Lil Jordan Humphrey in week 2 was the slot wide receiver for the Denver Broncos, and he proved to have a pretty decent game in the slot. Let me see here. Yeah, 5 catches for 50 yards last week in the slot. Vele, I believe, had a pretty decent stat line in week 1, so the slot wide receiver is playing a better role. Courtland Sutton's an outside receiver, and I don't think Bo Nix is looking his way that much. I mean, he's just looked bad. Another wide receiver that's looked bad is Christian Kirk. Is he even the wide receiver 1 on this Jacksonville team anymore? I mean, Brian Thomas Jr. has been a stud. He's young. He did find the end zone, but Kirk only has 7 targets on the year. Trevor Lawrence struggling to get him the ball. I don't even think he's the wide receiver 1 on the Jags. In my opinion, it's Brian Thomas Jr., as I just said. But I would sit Christian Kirk, try to avoid him this week. It's not the best situation for Christian Kirk because we're literally just waiting on him. Hey, when is he going to become a factor? When is he going to do what he did? But he's at Buffalo. Buffalo's corners and secondary in general look great. They stopped Tyreek and Waddle, even though Tua did go down with that injury. They still did not allow them to do much before Tua went out. Those are some sits, the wide receiver position, some sleepers at the wide receiver position. Wide receiver Jerry Jeudy of the Cleveland Browns. Jerry Jeudy's had double-digit fantasy point games in back-to-back weeks. He's looked one of the better receivers in this Browns offense. And dare I say it, but Deshaun Watson loves him. He's looking his way a lot. The Giants secondary is not great, and I expect him to capitalize on this poor Giant secondary. I think he's going to get open. He's scored double-digit fantasy points in back-to-back weeks. I think you can trust him as a flex play. He has a pretty good floor, and maybe this is a week he booms because this Giants defense is not great, especially in the secondary. Their front 7 is where I worry with the Giants, they do a great job up front. But other than that, this Giants team, they just haven't looked great. I mean, sure, they almost beat Washington, but man, they scored 3 touchdowns and allowed Washington to kick 7 field goals and still lost. It was just a disastrous performance. I mean, the Giants organization as a whole is it's not great. So fire up Jerry Jeudy. I think he's going to have a decent week. I'm comfortable with him as a flex play. Another flex play I like is Deontay Johnson. I think he gets back on track in week 3 against the Las Vegas Raiders. Andy Dalton is quarterbacking this offense now. So that helps Deontay Johnson a lot. Deontay Johnson, wide receiver 3, flex play. Fire him up because, Bryce Young was not getting it done. Bryce Young was hurting this offense. I think he was just rattled at QB, the pressure, and he just did not look like himself. So I think Andy Dalton helps this offense as a whole. Another sleeper I like, and honestly, I'd have him as a start. Jackson Smith-Njigba, emerging as the wide receiver 2 in this offense, had 16 targets last week. 16 targets. That's a lot of targets. And if they're targeting him that much in week 3, I mean, he should be a no doubt flex play for you this week. It's hard to not start JSN, especially with all these injuries at the wide receiver position like Deebo Samuel, Cooper Kupp, and Puka Nacua. Now a bust at the wide receiver position. This one is tough. I think you still got to start him just being who he is, but I would not, if you have a better option out there somehow. I mean, in one of my leagues, I'm sitting Garrett Wilson tonight because I have Nico Collins, Rashee Rice, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. How did I end up with those wide receivers? I don't know. Honestly, I think it had something to do with ESPN ADP having Rashee Rice so low and me being able to get Rashee Rice later. But still, sitting Garrett Wilson, he already scored a touchdown. I mean, what else? I just couldn't do it. I had better options. And if you have better options than this guy, Malik Neighbors, then start those better options. But if this is one of the better guys you have and you don't want to sit him, don't sit him. But I'm saying this is when I talk about bust, this is what I talk about. Guys who you would normally start, but I could see them busting. And this is the reason I can see Malik Neighbors busting. Cleveland is one of the better defenses in the NFL, especially their secondary. Neighbors is tied second in targets, though. He's coming off a stellar game against the Washington Commanders in week 2. But the Giants will have to scheme up some creative plays to get Neighbors open in space where he can do most of the damage. It's going to be tough, though, because Cleveland, not only is their secondary good, but they can bring a pass rush. And this Giants offense has not looked great at protecting Daniel Jones. And if Daniel Jones is running for his life, he's not going to have time to throw it to Malik Neighbors. Myles Garrett is going to, I think, get in there for at least 1 or 2 sacks on Daniel Jones. So definitely proceed with caution when starting Neighbors. I could see him busting this week, but if you can't sit him, I don't fault you for it. I think I'm going to start him, frankly, over Drake London just because that Kansas City matchup seems a little more tougher, in my opinion, and I'd rather have Malik Neighbors out there just because I know he can do some damage if he gets the ball in his hands. And Brian Dable's going to have to scheme some stuff up to get creative with this Cleveland defense, especially it being in Cleveland. But I can see Malik Neighbors busting, as much as I hate to say it. Let's move on to the tight end position. And this start should really come as no surprise. The only tight end to score double-digit points in back-to-back weeks, in week 1 and week 2, he's the rookie, Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers of the Vegas Raiders gets the Panthers at home for the Raiders' first home game. And honestly, there's no reason you should be sitting Brock Bowers. He's a top 5 tight end the rest of the year, in my opinion, and you should set it and forget it. He should be in your lineup each and every week, especially with how bad this position is. So it's also tough finding sits in this position because you really got to try and start everyone you can. But a sit at the tight end position is Juwan Johnson. Juwan Johnson did score in week 1, didn't do great in week 2. He's not getting a lot of snaps. Foster Moreau's out snapping him. Foster Moreau is the starting tight end. I don't know if this has something to do with Juwan Johnson just getting back right before week 1, but maybe they're taking it easy at slowing him back in. He does present a good amount of upside because he can score a lot. He did great at the end of last year. He can score touchdowns. He does great catching the ball. He has great hands, but he's gotten outsnapped by Moreau. So why would you start him? I think you got to sit Juwan Johnson this week. I would just look elsewhere. The Eagles stopped Kyle Pitts on Monday Night Football, and I think they do a good job against tight ends. So I would not play Juwan Johnson. As far as a sleeper at the tight end position, there's two of them. I saw the J. Thought Juwan Johnson. Tight end Jonnu Smith is a sleeper. There's no Tua, so I expect Mike McDaniel to fire up some short area targets for Jonnu Smith to get the ball out from Skylar Thompson to Jonnu Smith quickly. Last week versus the Seahawks, last week the Seahawks played against Hunter Henry. They allowed Hunter Henry to go for 8 catches, 109 yards. Man, what if Jonnu Smith does the same thing? I could see him having 100 yards if they get him these short area targets and he just racks up catches and gets like 10 yards a catch. I could see Jonnu Smith having a pretty good game, and I know he's probably out there in majority of leagues if you're hurting for a tight end. Another tight end I really like is Mike Gesicki. If T. Higgins plays, it worries me a little more, but he's had 10 catches for 109 yards in 2 games. Pretty good for the tight end position considering what we're working with, and there's not much depth. So if he's somehow still out there, I know it's very hard if you're in a deeper league. Like, I doubt Mike Gesicki's out there, but if you're in a shallower league, he could be out there and he could help you. And I don't really have a bust at the tight end position this week just because, frankly, anyone could bust, but I may have more information on the bust at the tight end position when I get the full weekly matchup analysis out. But as for right now, I really don't have too much. Let's move into defenses and kickers. So some defensive plays that I could see great for streaming wise is the Bucks, just because they play Denver and they're at home. The Seahawks, if they're somehow still out there, I know they're picked up in like about 50 to 60% of leagues, so they could be out there for you. They get Miami without Tua, and Miami's got to travel from Miami to Seattle. So great home game for Seattle. The 12th man is going to be at full effect, and I think that helps that Seattle defense even more with Skylar Thompson at quarterback. So fire up the Seahawks defense. A couple other sleeper defenses I do like are the Packers defense. Will Levis has looked horrible turnover-wise. And then the Bears. The Bears are underrated. They did a great job at slowing down that Texans offense in Houston. They've got to go to Indianapolis and slow them down, but I think it's possible. We saw it with the Packers last week. They slowed down Anthony Richardson. I think the Bears could too. And some defenses not to play. I would avoid the Vikings. I would avoid the Vikings because Houston could come into Minnesota and absolutely put up a ton of points, and this game could turn into a shootout. Minnesota's been one of the higher scoring defenses this week, but I have them as my bust at the defensive position for this week. As for a defense to sit, I'd sit the Eagles. Sure, they did all right against the Falcons in week 2, but this Saints offense is way different. I think they're more high-powered than the Falcons, and the Eagles have to go to New Orleans, so that doesn't bode well for the Eagles. The Saints have put up a league-high 91 total points in 2 games against, now week 1 was the Panthers, but week 2 was the Cowboys. Cowboys are one of the better defenses in this league, and I'm not loving this Eagles defense, especially with this Saints O-line looking the way it does and the way Clint Kubiak is scheming up plays. And Derek Carr, man, he's looked good. So those are some defenses I would avoid, Vikings and Eagles. Let's move on to the kickers. Kickers, I think you should start Evan McPherson of the Bengals. If he's somehow out there, I think you should start him. No doubt about it. They're playing a horrible Washington defense. I expect them to put up a ton of points in this one, and they're at home. Another kicker, a couple kickers, Jason Myers of Seattle, Blake Grupe. I do like Blake Grupe. New Orleans has been putting up points. They're kicking in a dome environment, so don't mind him. And then a kicker I want to avoid this week is Jason Sanders of the Miami Dolphins. Like I've been preaching, losing Tua really hurts this offense. Now, I expect Mike McDaniel to scheme up plays for Tyreek Hill, Devon Achane, Jalen Waddle, Jonnu Smith. They've got to get the ball in the playmakers' hands for this offense. But the Seattle defense, man, they've looked good. And Mike Macdonald, I mean, last year he coached, was the defensive coordinator, coached the Ravens defense, and was one of the better defensive coordinators in the league, if not the best defensive coordinator, which really got him this head coaching job. And this Seattle defense, I think, is only growing stronger and stronger. And I like their matchup this week, and they have a string of favorable matchups. So I'm avoiding Jason Sanders at the kicker position. And that's going to be it for the start, sit, sleepers, and busts at each position for week 3. I really appreciate you all listening to this episode. It's one of the quicker episodes I've had recently, so I appreciate it. If you want to see the full matchup analysis of every game, every start, sit, sleeper, and bust, follow me on Twitter or the X at BA Sports Podcasts. You can find me there. You can find the weekly matchup analysis there. So every Saturday, it'll come out every Saturday, a day before NFL Sunday. And then today I released the Thursday night football weekly matchup analysis. So yeah, I appreciate you guys listening to this week 3 preview of the start, sit, sleepers, and busts. And make sure you follow the BA Sports Podcast on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, wherever you find podcasts, and share it with a friend. Rate us 5 stars. It really helps us grow. So thank you all so much for listening. I hope you have a great Friday, great weekend, and a great week 3 winning your fantasy matchup. So yeah, thank you guys for listening.